Hours ago, I spoke to Ivor Ichikowitz. He's a South African entrepreneur who's also the founder and executive chair of the Paramount Group and Trans-Africa Capital. I started by asking him if AGOA, the African Growth Opportunities Act, in its present form, is fit for purpose.
It was about trade. It wasn't about investment. It wasn't about industrialization. And I think that there is definitely a sentiment here in the United States that it is no longer fit for purpose. You know, the deals that were announced at the summit are all investment deals, infrastructure deals, significant amounts of finance being made available for new projects and new deals. I mean, to be quite frank, the Americans are today using the Chinese language. What I sat and listened to over the last couple of days was China's strategy 10 years ago for Africa.
You know, when we talk about this nexus between trade and investment, they sort of do go hand in hand. The investments in infrastructure are certainly necessary, but the products, the services that will emerge from that wave of investments has to go somewhere. It could be to other African countries, could be over to the United States. And here we are trying to essentially establish a continental free trade area on the continent. How does then AGOA, whatever might replace it come 2025, then plug into that?
We mustn't forget that by 2050, Africa will have the biggest youth population in the world. Africa will have the biggest consumer base in the world. Africa will have one of the biggest labor bases in the world. So I think that the new trade deal isn't necessarily about how Africa sells to the United States or sells to the rest of the world. It's more about how the United States can help Africa through the transfer of technology to create industry for manufacture in Africa and consumption in Africa. I think that the whole dynamic is going to shift. In the past, the Africa-West relationship was all about exporting raw commodities for processing value add in the West. For Africa to grow, for African economies to grow, industrialization is not optional. It is absolutely not optional. Beneficiation of raw materials is not optional. So any new trade agreement is going to be for the benefit of the West. And any new investment arrangement will be for mutual benefit, because investment in African infrastructure, African industry, African capacity creation will create jobs on the continent, which will reduce poverty, which will reduce the necessity for Africans to consider migration, which in turn will reduce the pressure on the West. And I think that finally, the United States is starting to understand that.
One of the other things that I found also just as interesting is, comparing and contrasting the approach from China and the approach from the United States. There's a big emphasis on public-private capital commingling to make these infrastructure investments that we're looking at in the continent. $8 billion in public and private financing to help South Africa, for example, replace its fleet of coal-fired power plants. Another $2 billion to build solar power plants over in Angola. But looking at it from the American perspective, if you don't have a sense of certainty about trade, about the investment conditions, over the long term, and AGOA's ending is roughly 3 years away, doesn't that act as a disincentive for capital to keep flowing from the US and to come into Africa?
There's no doubt in my mind that something will replace AGOA. This administration is very action-orientated. What's come out of the summit is that this is not just a talk shop. The Americans are very serious about this. There is a clear plan to make these strategic investments, to re-engage diplomatically, to re-engage using economic diplomacy, which frankly has never been a feature of US engagement with Africa in the past.
But, from the perspective of African leaders, I mean, is there really any sort of confidence that this will change in the long run? And this is a context in which I'm phrasing that question. 2014, you have the US-Africa summit. 2 years later, Trump comes into the White House. The entire US-Africa policy changes completely. Now here we are in 2022 and Africa is back on the table. That sort of on-off, hot-cold relationship or hot-cold approach to managing relations with Africa certainly doesn't bode well. I mean, from a policymaker's perspective here on the continent, the argument could be that, they're simply an unreliable partner.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that the Biden administration realizes that they're on the back foot as far as that is concerned. American strategy and policy for Africa has been very, very on-off. That has to change. There's no question that there's a little bit of skepticism. I think everybody's very encouraged. I think everybody's very hopeful. I think there's a very positive energy in the air. But the proof of the pudding is going to be in the eating. And I think that it's going to be necessary for the US to have some very quick wins in order to gather and gain the confidence that is required to make that problem go away.